Hi everyone, I hope you had a good flex week. We are now at week 7. So straight on coming back, we get into immersive design teams and the design pipeline. So we can look at this as a bit of a chore topic, or we can also try and see if we can make it interesting. I am definitely not a management type person, and this, I think, is a lot to do about management and a little bit of business. So let's go back and have a look at what's involved in creating an immersive system. Now, we've mentioned it several times already, and we've talked about it. We'll go through it again. Immersive design is a really interdisciplinary medium, so it basically needs everyone, right? Application developers, that's where I am. Hardware engineers, that's where some of my friends are. Experience designers, again, some of my friends and other colleagues. Audio specialists, that's what my brother is. Architects, some people that we know. Do I have any architect friends? Well, I guess I do. 2D and 3D artists, so basically just about everyone. So I hope, like, in this list, that you would have seen yourself. And I hope you would have seen people that you know personally and you can empathize with, because then you will know their priorities and how they fit with your own priorities, and it makes it a lot easier to negotiate. Because in my experience, all these different fields definitely have different priorities, and the key to creating a good experience and creating a good quote-unquote product is really having your priorities set. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a design that tries to satisfy everyone but fails in all accounts because it doesn't do enough of anything. But having said that, there are certainly ways of keeping everyone happy, so we have a really happy team, and if you have a really happy team, you have a really good product. I think that's a little bit beside the point, a little bit. I mean, that statement doesn't really help you understand immersive design teams and the pipeline, but it gives you some really good context. Speaking of context, let's have a look at this. Now, since we like user-centric design and we're adherents to that ethos, let's start from the center where everything comes from, and that is the user. So I guess if we were to make it a little bit more specific, the user would either be the public or directly clients and customers, which aren't necessarily the public, but these are the people that have engaged our services to try and come up with some kind of a solution using immersive design. So that's fairly self-explanatory. We need to always be thinking about them. But on our side of the team, we have our quality assurance testers. So if you're lucky enough to be in a team that's big enough with a QA team, it really, really makes your life easier if you're one of these other guys, because that means you can just go ahead and make your thing and send it to the QA team, and then they'll do thorough testing, they'll give you back a report and tell you what needs fixing. And if you're like me, it'll be like get into arguments with them. It's like, hey, that's not a bug. And there is this trope of developers not particularly liking the QA team because it's just a joke. In healthy teams, you really need to have that kind of honest feedback to be able to produce the best kind of product. But you can kind of see the adversarial relationship in that situation there already. So QA testers are not usually very senior people, and that's not really a slight on them, not to insult or anything. It's just a fact of life. It seems like most entry-level positions in the industry, especially in game design, would be QA testers. And I guess the reason for that is it doesn't really need any specialized skills that these other positions would need. But an automatic qualification that all of us humans have is that we are potential users. and most of our qualities and most of the things that we don't like and not like and like is pretty common, generally speaking. And what I mean by that is most people are able to participate in, say, perception tests to see if certain kinds of colors or certain kinds of sounds are able to elicit the expected reactions or expected effects. And at the very basic level, having specialized people that's able to just give you user testing data right on the dot in-house without having to go through a lot of trouble to get the testers, that's actually very, very valuable. The next step above that is you have these testers that are super pedantic and thorough, and what they can do is they're able to test your product to a certain degree to be able to find bugs and mistakes and the flaws and things in a methodical and structured way, so it's those problems are able to be found before you actually go release it to either the client or the public, and that's also very, very valuable. So actually, even though like if you look through position descriptions and things like that, quality assurance testers are at the very, very entry level and the most junior level. As you go up the ranks, the QA testing team is actually super important inside any immersive design team. So let's it goes back to human-centric design. So let's have a bit of respect for them, even though they're really annoying, because they're the ones who keep coming back to you and say, hey, this is a mistake, and you're like, oh. So that's that. Let's keep going along the circle. So then we end up with state tracking. So now we're thinking about the parts of an immersive system that involves, getting biometric data from the user, position, that kind of thing. And usually that's to do with hardware engineers because, we're talking about microphones, we're talking about eye tracking, we're talking about tracking systems. But we might also be thinking about biologists and psychologists because maybe we might be using, neural input type things. So, for example, things that keep track of how your muscles react. So, for example, all the professionals that need to be involved in designing brain-computer interfaces. If you remember back to the Modes of Interaction B lecture. So, going back to the design team, we basically need the biologists and psychologists to understand the signals that are being interpreted from the devices that the hardware engineers have created, and then we need the coders to make it all work. So you might notice that all around the cycle I've put in coders in here because I'm a coder and I'm biased like that. But this obviously isn't an exhaustive list of all the required specializations in every single stage of the interaction cycle. The idea with this is to just kind of give you a flavor, a little bit of an idea of what's needed. So if we go into the interaction control system, then it's no longer really about the hardware and interpreting basic signals. It's now taking that information and then doing something interesting with it. So if you're an interaction designer, you'd be trying to answer a question of I can get eye tracking data that the user is looking at this particular object inside my virtual environment. What should I do about that? Should I anticipate that they need that particular thing that they're using or looking at? Or should I highlight that object? That kind of question. And then I guess in 9903, when we finish this unit and go start the 9903, we can talk a little bit more about how to make that even deeper and maybe even more meaningful by creating nice narrative in conjunction with immersive design. That's really powerful. And then we move on to all the assets and everything that need to populate our virtual environment, or it doesn't even have to be virtual. We could be designing, you know, a live in-person experience. So you can see that the skill sets in here don't necessarily need to be exclusively for immersive design. In fact, they come from other fields. We just, you know, take advantage of them in immersive design. And then we go full circle in here, where once we've decided what to do with all the fancy input, we now need to make the user feel something. So you'll see that it's very similar to the input stuff here, because we're getting information out from a user, and sometimes that means directly taking data out of someone's body. And then here we're now directly putting data into someone's body. And just reminding ourselves of this a bit. So what are examples of sensory feedback devices? Well, the most obvious one in virtual reality would be the display headset, the screens inside that's, you know, showing two different screens into your eyes, so you have this sense of depth. That's one primary way of giving feedback back to the user. So that screen is going to need hardware engineers to be able to create the little LCD or OLED or micro OLED, basically fancy optics. The exact specifics in this case doesn't necessarily matter, but you just need to get the idea that, you know, to be able to create the optics, it needs some kind of specialization for hardware engineering. And somewhere in there, we still need biologists and psychologists to make sure that, you know, what the signals that we're sending to the human is actually receivable and safe. So, you know, in the case of a screen, we need to make sure it's not too bright, that it blinds people, or it's not flashing or something. So all that information informs what the hardware engineers create to make sure that, you know, whatever we end up with is compliant safety-wise and actually will end up working as well. So that's just a quick sort of run around the block of all the different specializations. Now it's worth asking yourself, where do I fit in this cycle here? So for me, since I would consider myself a designer, I would be in the interaction designers thing. Primarily, I also happen to be a coder, so I will fit here. But mostly I do most of my coding to support the interaction control system. I don't really do too much hardware level code to, you know, to deal with the screen and correctly make that run. I guess also, just because of the topic of my PhD, I would also have a little bit of this. My studies are showing or going towards finding out what the most efficient visualizations or visual variables that need to be used to be able to communicate to the user in the most efficient way. But I guess that's not really purely in psychology. That all sort of, you know, branches a little bit into design. But I guess my point of, or the point of me kind of trying to break this down a little bit is you might be in multiple places. You don't necessarily need to be in one place. So where in here do you fit? You might fit in multiple places. I guess we all definitely fit in here. We can be super annoying to everyone. So I guess when it gets to your assignment testing phase, we're going to be testing each other's prototypes. So like this is, we all fit here. Okay, so that's one way to look at things, but you'll notice this isn't really a production cycle. It's not really a pipeline. So a pipeline or a team would look a little bit more like this one. So this structure is kind of like a generalized structure. Like, not all teams look exactly like this, but they look very similar to it. So I'm getting this kind of generalized structure from just people that I know. So I have friends at Red Cartel. That's a local, recently acquired virtual reality company up in the northern beaches. Alta VR, Tima and team, they just got $20 million in funding to continue working on a township tale. In fact, we actually got Tima to come last year to try and talk a little bit about what it's like. I think they recently just got their funding when I invited them, the Tima, to come along. I didn't really end up inviting anyone to come along this term for week 7. The schedules just didn't turn out well. You might notice that there's a very big game development conference happening right now in San Francisco called the Game Developers Conference. So I guess the schedules just didn't align, so you have me talking about this. Well, my own experience in this kind of thing is my work over at the Immersive Technologies team in the Pro Vice Chancellor of Education and Student Experience over in main campus in Kensington, where we created educational virtual reality and augmented reality experiences, but also in actual industry over at DXC Technology. So that's the biggest IT consulting firm. I was a tech lead there. Actually, my boss said the tech lead. I was there for 8 months until I decided to come back and do PhD. But this isn't really a history lesson. So basically, usually what happens is you have these little sub-teams, and each of these sub-teams have a director. So I guess he says the big overall big teams, I guess we'll call them departments. These will be the primary ones. And then if the team is big enough, there might be sub-teams within those teams. And for those who have had some experience in this kind of environment, this might all resonate with you, but just bear with me. Now, each of these different departments have their own specialization, and it's their job to do that particular part of the project well. So for example, if you're an art director, you're in charge of keeping a coherent vision of what the design language, if you will, of the product is going to be. So basically, the graphics and the presentations and all that is all consistent, and it feels like it comes from the same place instead of a big jumble. Unless the goal of the project itself is to elicit that kind of feeling, in which case you would make it a big jumble. But basically, the art director person is there to keep it all consistent. Then this person might have an argument with the technical director, because what they want to do in terms of art is really, really difficult, or it makes the technical direction, or it's not technically possible. It may. But generally what would happen is these two would have some kind of a negotiation, and you end up with some kind of compromise that everyone can live with. Now, usually when that happens, it might not happen directly between these two directors. It might happen with this person up here in the same room trying to mediate. And really the goal of this person here is to try and satisfy these people over here. So I guess in the case of my experience at DXC, like it's a consulting firm, we usually just got custom jobs either from the Navy or the Australian Federal Police, or some oil company or something like that. This person here would take all that into account and make sure that the goals and requirements of the external stakeholders actually get done by all these different people underneath. So whether that's through a negotiation or some kind of fancy schmancy management type thing, eventually it just needs to get done. So this person is the person that needs to well, hopefully you get this expression, played Tetris with all the different pieces with the teams that they have. But keep in mind that these sub-teams are also doing the same thing within their own realms. And, well, I guess if you look at this, if you're small enough, if you're not really a big outfit, ideally you should have separate people for all these different positions, but you sometimes just not big enough to have enough people, so sometimes people double up. And I found that to be a bad situation because you end up with conflict of interest, basically. So like a really bad situation might be if you have an art director who is also the technical director. So usually what might end up happening is they might prioritize one role over the other. So like if we just take it from my perspective, if I was the technical director, this has never happened, by the way, but if I was the technical director and I was also the art director at the same time, so I've been the technical director, but I've never been the art director of anything. But yeah, if I were to be given the art director position at the same time as I was technical director, all the art stuff would just fall to crap because I really want things to perform really, really super well. So I guess if you look at a project like Minecraft, for example, so that's an example of what might end up coming out. Super, super bad graphics, but a nice performance. And now Minecraft is the most popular game ever, and it was bought out by Microsoft for $2 billion. So, well, it might not always turn out bad. Anyway, hopefully this bit kind of makes sense. You can ask me questions, and we can discuss it more in class if there are some things that need further clarification. Okay, cool. So again, the typical project cycle comes from my experience, mostly from DXC technology and also my experience at the Immersive design team. But I'm also combining stories and complaints from just friends of mine in the field. So this particular example is covering the situation where you have an external customer that that's hired your consulting firm to be able to do something. So usually what happens is you have what's called customer requirements gathering, or maybe there's another term for that, but basically what usually happens there is you have like a sit-down meeting with your client. If you're over in the Immersive Tech team that runs Lightroom, it would be that the lecturer, like say from chemistry or mathematics, would sit down with either Graham, the manager of that team, and then maybe some people in the development team, and they'd basically just hash out ideas. So like I guess in one concrete example would be when Danielle Mansfield came over to us and said, I want to be able to do vector arithmetic in virtual reality because our students don't understand anything, or something like that. So then we had that initial meeting and saying, hey, basically he'd come up with ideas, and then we'd say, oh, this is what's possible. Have you thought about this one? And sometimes this can go across multiple meetings. So basically, you have the initial meeting here. The team comes up with a proposal, and then you have another meeting, and then either the customer will be like, oh, that sounds great, let's proceed and do the first concept, or like maybe we're not super fans of these ideas, maybe you can just go back, hear some feedback, do it again, and then the cycle goes along. So it just keeps going like that until such time that we're all kind of happy. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily need to be a customer problem that puts it back, like basically restarts the cycle again. But essentially, like we only proceed when everyone's happy. I guess in this case, I've I've made it so that the customer does the final sign-off. It doesn't necessarily need to be like that, but yeah, usually that's the case. So it's like you do the concept, does the proposal, and until such time that the customer likes it, you just keep going. So when the customer actually does like it, you end up producing your first prototype, and then within the team you kind of just keep refining it and refining it and refining it, until you're satisfied that you want to bring the customer back in again and say, hey, have a look at this. So you'll see that there are lines kind of going all over the place. It might actually go back a step. So if in the concept production phase and then the internal user testing phase we've found that it's just completely unworkable, you might end up going back to a new concept ideation. So yeah, it doesn't always flow like that. But you'll see, in these different lines, in a particular good run, you could just have like, okay, initial meeting with the customer, you ideate a concept, customer loves it, you produce a concept, you do your first testing, and it turns out it's perfect. And then you go to final delivery. Or maybe you want to call in the customer again just to test it and then do the final sign off, and then you have final delivery. But you can see that it can still either go back to refining the product, refining the design, and going back to this, or it can even so like what one nightmare scenario might be like, you go initial meeting, you have a concept ideation, you have another meeting, it gets approved, and then you start making it, and then in the first cycle of testing you end up having to go back. This kind of cycle, this kind of sequences of things falls under the agile development methodology, where you basically it's in the name, you have to be agile. And I've put a note in here to say that it's anti-waterfall, because in the waterfall the scenario, you're not actually allowed to go back steps. That's why it's called waterfall. But let's not really cover that in too much detail today, or at all today, because no one uses waterfall. It's a legacy concept as far as I can tell, going back to very rigid engineering principles. And I guess like in situations like aerospace engineering, or things where there's safety critical things that need to happen, maybe this still works. But when we're creating, when we're doing something a little bit more creative and less safety critical, like an immersive design situation, then it's counterproductive to be very rigid. And there's an article in the reading list that explains this in more detail, so I would encourage you to have a look at that as well. I think I'm going over time a little. I think I might be going over my 20-minute limit here. So sorry about that, but I hope the extra exposition is helping. And if we need more exposition, you can ask that in class, post something in the forum, or send me an email. So we've already talked a little bit about this back in user testing and prototyping. This slide, I mean. So I guess these are the testing methods that you might want to be using when you're iterating on your assignment 2 design. So there is still room for Wizard of Oz for the digital prototypes that I'm trying to encourage you to use. But I guess Wizard of Oz is mostly done with paper prototypes, where paper doesn't have its own internal functionality, so you basically need to do everything manually and fake it. So now you have the benefit of having the easy peasy interaction toolkit in Unity, or if you're using something like Figma or something like that, you don't necessarily need Wizard of Oz, but like it's good to know about it. I would imagine the talk aloud protocol might be useful for you. So like when you give someone a prototype to test, you can ask them to verbalize what they're thinking, and that'll give you some insight as to why they're using your prototype in the way that they're doing. And I guess like to get really good at this, to be a really good testing subject, it takes a little bit of time. Just like why I like back when we were talking about these guys, I was encouraging everyone to give them a lot of respect, because that takes a lot of skill, and also it takes a lot of time to build that skill, and having that insight is super useful. So it could mean the difference between having a good product and a complete failure. And then I guess we have survey questions, and then just behavioral metrics. So I guess survey questions would like you could end up designing that well or not. We can talk a little bit more about what constitutes a good survey question and a bad survey question. But for your assignments, I would encourage you more to use behavioral metrics. And behavioral metrics really is just that, it could just be as basic as, have they reached the goal? Like, were they able to do the thing that I wanted them to do? And that kind of metric is much more useful usually than just having a survey. But sometimes surveys also have their place. But I guess for your assessment, if we were to just think about a concrete example, a behavioral metric would be simply a question of were they able to find the keys using my augmented reality key finding app? That's a very unambiguous behavioral metric. Or how many menu items did the user have to go through before they actually got to the thing that they wanted? So that's also a very useful, unambiguous, and objective behavioral metric. So yeah, we can talk about that individually in class about your specific projects, but that's basically the idea. It doesn't leave any room for ambiguity. Whereas a survey question, like you'd have to interpret that it's qualitative data, that's it, and for the kinds of things that we want to end up designing in this class, maybe survey questions not so great, but survey questions would be pretty good for 9901 and also 9903, because it's very introspective, and I guess you can ask more open-ended questions like, how did this make you feel? But yeah, I just wanted to talk really quickly about immersive design teams and the pipeline. We do have quite a bit of reading material as well, so please go through that, and we'll discuss that more in class. And hopefully we'll start making good progress in your assessment 2 as well, based on your assessment 1. And see you in class. Thanks for watching.